Hello, Earthlings! I hope your planetary quarantine isn't getting you down too much. As for me, this is as close as I'm coming. Social distancing, you know.
Hello everybody, in this video I will tell you why I think that capitalism is bad and why it has to be replaced.
A lot of you have asked me to do one of Viki 1999's videos. I've told you why I haven't. The very first thing Viki said about me was a disgusting and reprehensible false accusation that I want to kill people who disagree with me. We're dealing with a horrible individual who is not here to debate properly. But you keep asking, so I'll do one, and I think you'll find the context I've just given you explains so much about Viki.
There are many ways to approach this, one of them is equality.
I'll just throw in a quote from Milton Friedman here that's as true now as it was the day he said it. A society that values equality over liberty will end up with neither one. But a society that values liberty over equality will wind up with a great measure of both.
Capitalism is very efficient when it comes to creating a lot of wealth. Unfortunately, it's very bad at distributing that wealth.
I've already shown Viki the statistics debunking this. With capitalism, you have lower wealth inequality and greater upward mobility among the poor. These morons always claim it, but they never back it up.
Pretty much all of the value the economy generates only benefits the top few percent of the population.
It's amazing how I just made a video about the definition of capitalism where I show mainstream economists, not Austrian or anarchists, saying that exactly the opposite is the case. Generating benefits for the top few percent was the norm before capitalism. It was capitalism that allowed people at the bottom rungs to build wealth for themselves. In 1500, there was no way you were getting anywhere if you were a serf or a peasant. But today, as I've shown over and over again, 92% of millionaires and 62% of billionaires in America are self-made. People like Viki never even want to acknowledge those statistics.
Another approach would be wasted time. Capitalism actually doesn't produce as much stuff as it needs to produce. It makes way more, like up to 40% more.
Better than starving!
The reason for that is complicated.
It's not really. It's called the economic calculation problem. No one can know how much bread or milk or butter or whatever people are going to need. So there are only two options. One, you put it in the hands of a central authority that isn't efficient and can't get any information on it, so they try to do the minimum they can and people starve. Or you leave it to the free market, where producers respond to consumer demand and compete with other producers trying to get an extra share of the market. And as a result, they end up overproducing a bit, and some of the milk on the shelves gets spoiled and has to be thrown out. Given that an exact calculation is impossible, which one is better? A bit of extra stuff produced that ends up being wasted, or people starving? But really, the 40% figure is misleading for a couple of reasons. One, it's all food waste, including things like chicken bones and other things that no one's going to eat to begin with. Second, you know who else wastes 40% of their food? Nigeria, a socialist country who is wasting that 40%, but, unlike America, still has starvation. Not only that, but 37% of Nigerian children have stunted growth due to poor nutrition, 18% were considered wasting, and 29% are underweight. So pick your poison there, Viki.
Take it that we all could work a whole lot less with the same pay if we stopped overproducing quite as much.
Doesn't work that way, moron. With fewer units produced, you'd be working less for less money. Look at a supply-demand graph sometime.
Next is that capitalism isn't good at distribution of resources.
This is absolutely hilarious, as there have been numerous economic treatises, again from mainstream economics, not Austrians or anarchists, showing that the market is a form of spontaneous order, resulting in the most efficient distribution of resources humanity has ever been able to accomplish. For one example, the transportation of food across the country is actually fairly complex, but it efficiently emerged as farming changed from subsistence to farmers moving to a farming industry, and crops and cattle needed to be moved from the farms to the store shelves all over the country. It is impossible possible for a central authority to do this, not only because of the difficulty of calculating where the goods should be distributed, but that the problem gets exponentially more difficult the more places it needs to be distributed to. It's a form of the traveling salesman problem.
In Europe and America, there is millions of tons of food waste every year, while 8 million people starve each year.
Did you notice the dishonest bait and switch here? Viki mentioned the food in Europe and America, but the 8 million figure is worldwide. What did I tell you at the very beginning? Viki is not interested in honest debate. First of all, 8 million people starving out of 8 billion people on the planet is unprecedentedly low. And those 8 billion people are not in the US, and most of them aren't in Europe. They're in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where their socialist governments actually intrude in the markets that are trying to create food for the people. Or their governments are blocking things like GMO crops that could be their lifeline. Or their governments are just part of a criminal underworld that's stealing the food to sell it on the black market. No matter how you look at it, it's nowhere near a capitalist free market. The starvation is happening because these countries aren't capitalist, and it's not just as simple as moving food from our countries to theirs. In fact, that can actually backfire, as it'll adversely affect the market for local farmers trying to produce food and make enough for them to live on. But something else Viki doesn't seem to want to mention. The world poverty rate has been cut in half in the last 20 years. And the number of hungry people worldwide has dropped by 216 million people between 1992 and 2012. That's an impressive figure when you consider that in these socialist crap holes in sub-Saharan Africa I just mentioned, hunger actually increased by 5 million people during that same time period. Starvation is not caused by capitalism. It's caused by government violence.
Capitalism promotes oligarchy.
Capitalism is the opposite of oligarchy. Capitalism, as I showed in my video, by the definition used by mainstream economists, is a system of voluntary trade between private individuals and groups. Any oligarchy is antithetical to that.
Since competition naturally leads towards monopolies.
Over crying out loud, how many times do we need to debunk that crap? And all of this is just in the first minute.
Those few then have more wealth and power than the rest of the population, which makes it a lot easier for them to bribe politicians.
And what did I say in that self-same video? What did those mainstream economists in a peer-reviewed article say specifically was not capitalism?
Capitalism is also undemocratic. All of the decisions of what and how to produce and where to sell it and for how much are made mostly centrally by big corporations.
Guess how I can tell you've never run a business? Yes, corporations make those decisions, but not arbitrarily. They make the decisions based on consumer demand. The more consumers they benefit, the more money they make. The more they go against what the consumers want, the more money they lose. It's the consumers that are king in capitalism. And notice how people like Viki never want to mention consumers.
The McDonald's management in the USA decides how much I have to pay for a cheeseburger in Vienna.
If they don't set that price at the equilibrium level of supply and demand, then one of two things will happen. If they set it too high, no one will buy their cheeseburgers and they'll lose business. If they set it too low, they won't be able to produce enough for everyone. Come on, this is Economics 101 here. Have you done any reading on the subject?
And all of those faults so far are just the obvious ones, which I don't have to explain further.
You mean you can't explain them further because they're lies!
Capitalism is just employers legally stealing from employees. Let me elaborate on that. This is a production process. This guy has a machine which takes in raw materials and outputs a product. But it has to be operated by someone, and since this guy isn't gonna do it himself, he hires someone. So one of them got more than they invested and one got less. And if we keep going, we'll realize that all of the profit this guy makes is value he didn't pay his employees.
And how did this lengthy diatribe, which is complete ignorance of how businesses actually work and are funded, but we'll let that go. How did that begin? This guy has a machine. Okay, where did the machine come from? Why is this always the starting point? Why do you people always skip over this necessary step? And how many times do we need to point that out?
Now, you may say, okay, maybe it's stealing, but it's not like there's a better system. And if that's your response, I hereby give you the homework to come up with a better system and tell me how it would work in the comments.
Homework fallacy. And he even used the word homework.
Even without stealing, capitalism is still unequal, wasting time, letting people starve, promoting corruption, and undemocratic.
You can assert it all you want, but you've done nothing to show it. All you've shown is your own dishonesty, as well as your own complete ignorance of how the world works. And that is why I won't do any more Viki videos. Hey, thanks for watching. Please hit like and subscribe and keep these videos coming by donating, becoming a subscriber and getting special benefits, or even for free with airtime. And check out all the great content here, like this video selected just for you.